شكرًا لكل الناس اللي بتحضر النهارده. STEM Talk النهارده هو funded by Boeing وده جزء من الSTEM Center activities. والSTEM Center الناس اللي ما تعرفش ده موجود في أميد إيست وده بدأناه من سنة وبرضه funded by Boeing وبيقدم STEM courses وكمان activities منهم الSTEM Talks. STEM Talks دي بنقدمها monthly فكل شهر بنركز على theme معين وبنقدم 2 sessions. we have session today وعندنا session تانية الأسبوع الجاي. guest speaker اللي معانا النهارده هي ميريت عصمت وميريت is a teaching assistant with 3 years of experience at the BUE. After being awarded the best dissertation award for her bachelor's thesis on climate change and crisis management. She widened the scope of research regarding this topic in her master's degree. topic النهارده هتكلمنا عنه هو climate resilient architecture designing for risk reduction. thank you so much ميرات انك معانا النهارده. أنا I made you co-host for the session you can start your session بقى and take the lead. وبرضه كل الناس هي السيشن is recorded. وبعد كده بعد ما نخلص السيشن it will be uploaded على السوشيال ميديا بحيث تقدروا ترجعوا لها تاني.
Okay, thank you so much for the warm welcome. And I just want to add the virtual background. One second. I think we're ready now. All right. Apologies. I just need to put up the presentation. Okay. Can everyone hear me properly?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Good evening, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be hosting this talk for you today. Thank you so much for the warm introduction, by the way. Today, my name is Mirette, and I will be speaking about a topic that, as she just mentioned, it's been one that I've been interested in for the past 4 years during my undergraduate and postgraduate studies. So I consider this very personal to me. And I hope that I can give you a positive perspective on the role of architects when it comes to what we're all very aware of right now, which is climate change. Okay, so before we jump in, I just want to make sure that I get one thing out of the way. So the intent of this talk is not to incite any type of panic or to just list some scary statistics on climate change, but it is to give you a positive perspective moving forward on how we as humanity can actually adapt to it now more than ever. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So before we get into everything, I just wanted to lay out the outline for the talk so that you guys know where we're at, you don't get lost or any of that. So first thing is the problem, which is climate change. And then we're going to move on to a solution, which is a form of a concept, which is resilience. We're going to get into that. But how do we transform from risk to resilience? And then we are going to give some examples on a wider scale, so an urban scale and on a building scale. So before we begin, I want you to imagine something with me. I want you to imagine that you're stranded on an island. And this island is self-sufficient. You have water, you have food, and you have a shelter above your head. And as time goes by, the water starts to get inside the island. It starts to devour at it, to the point where one day you walk out and your ankles are submerged in water. Okay, so this is a very simplified metaphor of sea level rise due to climate change. It's not as harsh as I make it sound, but it is also not that far off from reality. So let's take this mental image and put it in reality. So we have coastal metropolises around the world. You have New York City, Sydney, Venice, Mumbai, not even far off from here, Alexandria. These are all beautiful coastal cities. And as much as they all have amazing views and they're heavily settled, a lot of people live around them, they're also threatened to climate change induced sea level rise. So I want to ask you a question. Do you think that all of these cities are going to look the same in a couple of years, in 10, 50, maybe 100 years? Naturally, no. But the reason behind the no is what we're going to be talking about today. So let's take this into a real life example. The subjected sea level rise that is predicted for, let's say, for example, for Egypt, the coastal Mediterranean part of Egypt, is as follows. By the year 2100, we're expecting to lose a lot of land just from sea level rise and coastal flooding. Can everyone hear me? Can you see the PowerPoint? Did everyone see the screen? Sorry about that. I thought it was frozen. Can anyone see the, oh, you guys are checking the chat. Yes, you can see the screen. All right, perfect. Sorry about that. So, okay, so which brings us to the problem that I keep telling you about. So what really is climate change in very simple terms? So according to the UN, this is the most defining issue of our time on a global scale, and it mandates immediate action. We can say that rapid climate change, as in like rising temperatures and global warming, is actually a consequence. It occurs naturally already. By time the climate changes, different things get into the atmosphere, and our planet is very dynamic. So it's not something that's static. It changes by time either way. However, human intervention has made this change quadruple in its speed. So the reason for that is actually carbon emissions. And when these carbon emissions start to get trapped into the atmosphere, it warms your weather, and then you have the melting of the ice, and then that leads to sea level rise, and then that leads to coastal flooding. But the world has a thing to say about this. We have been trying to reduce this impact. We're very aware of it, and now more than ever, we can actually see it on a personal level. So ever since the beginning of the 21st century, when those impacts have started to show very predominantly on the planet, a lot of the governments around the world have been coming together and trying to find a way to kind of mitigate it or stop it or prevent it. And the way that they've done that is there are many frameworks around the world, but one of the most important ones to mention is the United Nations Paris Climate Agreement, where they agreed that ever since the pre-industrial times, the weather has already been changing. The global temperature has been getting affected due to all these carbon emissions that we're producing after the Industrial Revolution. So they've come together and they've agreed that we have to maintain the mean global rise in temperature below the 2-degree Celsius trajectory. The reason for that is if we reach the 3 degrees Celsius, this is catastrophic warming, and this is when like natural disasters would skyrocket. So in order to limit that, we need to decrease and cut our emissions by half by the year 2030, which is actually not that far off. However, I want to ask you another question. Do you think that if we cut emissions, global warming would just vanish? Do you think so? I think someone wrote, no. Yeah, that's actually true. No, that's actually not the case. If we were to cut down all of global emissions by tomorrow, we will still be dealing with climate change because in a way, some of that damage is already done and it's inevitable. So that's not to say that we shouldn't be heading towards more of a zero carbon type of construction or a net zero type of construction. That's not what I'm saying at all. Besides, we should be doing that, but we should be looking at other things. So we've already produced quarters of 3,700 gigatons of carbon dioxide that we were supposed to produce into the atmosphere in order to prevent any catastrophic warming. So there's a long way to go when it comes to cutting down emissions, not to mention that it's extremely costly. It requires a lot of technology and it needs a lot of time in order to kind of like transform everything we used to in the way that is green and sustainable and so on. But that's not to say we shouldn't do it. So just like I asked you, the world without emissions is not equivalent to a world without global warming or climate change. So where does architecture come into that? Architectural role in this is huge. It's more than we can ever imagine. The reason for that is because emissions are the largest contributor to the problem. And since they're the largest contributor, I can use it as a double-edged sword. It can also be the solution. So buildings and the construction industry are responsible for 3/4 of all the carbon dioxide that is produced into the atmosphere. It utilizes 40% of the energy, and it utilizes 40% of the natural resources, and it consumes 25% of global water. Now, if you ask me, those are big numbers. So just the building sector itself is responsible for this dilemma. But there are two types of carbon as well. The reason they are that big of percentages. The first type of carbon is embodied carbon. Now that is existent in the materials themselves. When you have concrete, when you have any type of engineered materials, they produce carbon into the atmosphere. That's just their natural life cycle. So that is embodied carbon. The second one is operational carbon emission, which comes from the burning of fossil fuels in order to provide all forms of energy so that you can run your house. So your electricity, your water, any of that stuff. Okay. So since they already have a huge impact on the planet, we can utilize them for good. I'm going to ask this one more time. Can you guys see the presentation? Yes. Okay. You can see. Okay. Okay, so climate change is a form of risk, but we can call many things risks. Yes, you guys can all see the presentation. Perfect. Okay, so what is actually a risk and how do we identify it? Okay, so a risk is, according to the UN, risk is the likelihood of a negative circumstance to occur or repercussions such as fatalities, loss of property, disrupted livelihoods, halted economic activity, environmental damage resulting from the interaction between natural and human inflicted risks, vulnerable scenarios. So it's a mix of both. You have the human inflicted risks, that the way that we live, the way that we construct, the way that we do most things that produce all these carbon emissions, and the natural causes in general. So a natural disaster, as we've mentioned, the earth is it's dynamic. You have the shifting of tectonic plates, you have things that occur naturally. So a mixture of all of these, they lead to negative repercussions, and these negative repercussions are considered risk. Now, the reason why I'm telling you risk is because it is a keyword to the way that we can actually solve this issue. We have components of disaster risk. And these are three main components. The first one is hazard. So in order for me to say, oh, this is a disaster risk, there has to be a form of hazard. And that hazard could be naturally occurring or human inflicted. So in that case, if the hazard is climate related, it could be a natural variability, a storm, for instance, just how the wind currents are occurring, or anthropogenic climate change, which is human inflicted climate change. So this is the first thing that guarantees that I have a risk. The second thing is vulnerability. And vulnerability is related to socioeconomic processes. Vulnerability is another way of saying the tendency for something to be negatively affected. That could be due to the demographic, the location, gender. So many things fall under the umbrella of vulnerability. Vulnerability could also be called sensitivity. So they're synonymous, or they're used synonymously in this context. And the last thing is exposure. Now, exposure is the physical aspect. The best thing about exposure is that you can actually measure it because it relies on the amount of population situated in a certain place. So if there's a huge amount of people in a certain area that's going to be flooded, that means there is a higher exposure. So it relies on the population density, in other words. So we've made this little risk equation in order to see, well, if there is risk, how can we actually solve it? We said we have dimensions of risk. Now, hazard is something which is expected, but hard to predict. So we have the rest of factors, which is vulnerability and adaptive capacity. We've mentioned that vulnerability is another word for sensitivity. But adaptive capacity is your capability as a system, as an individual, to adapt and cope to a certain hazard. So the more we increase this adaptive capacity, the less we become vulnerable. And the way that we're going to be suggesting that is when we talk about it in the sense of architecture or buildings, we need to make the building adaptive or resilient. But we're going to get to that after just this mini. So risk reduction through risk assessment. In order to really know what that risk is, to kind of grasp a hold of it, you need to know how to assess it. And you do that through a set of 7 steps. You need to understand your existing conditions. So we're going to give an example of that. And then we need to assess the hazard, the degree of exposure, the breakdown of vulnerability. We need to analyze loss and impact. We report this risk and we put all the estimates and all the statistics out there so that we can prepare for it through strategies, through planning, through design, etc. So we're going to be giving a real life example here. Egypt's coasts, they're extremely vulnerable for so many reasons, but one of the main reasons is because of existing conditions of the Mediterranean coast, for instance. I'm just going to be focusing on the Mediterranean coast here. So one of the main things that we have is we have low-lying lands. And by low-lying lands, I mean that they are just low in general. So if a little bit of water starts to increase, or like the sea level starts to increase, it's bound to get flooded because it's already at a low elevation. We have plenty of that around our coast, and that's one of the main reasons why they're actually under risk. If you can see here, these arrows are all risk areas around the Mediterranean coast. You might think that's few, but that's actually a lot in the future kind of context. So not only are they low, they are extremely densely populated. Throughout the world, throughout centuries, actually, whenever we look at human civilization, we look at it around bodies of water because that's the natural way that civilization has come to term. You find water, that means there is plenty of room for resources and life. So we naturally put our settlements there. And as we've evolved, we have become like a lot and overpopulated. So these coastal areas, not only are they low, but they're also densely populated. So this shows us that the existing conditions prep they pave the way for something to already be vulnerable. And the last thing is that they have few engineered defenses and natural barriers. If you can see around this key is the only areas that have engineered structures, such as dams, such as protective engineering of dams or flood walls or etc. Okay, So according to a report conducted, which identified the year 2000 as its baseline for its research, the population density in the beginning of the 21st century residing in low-lying areas were only 25.5% of the total population. But if we were to expect that the sea level rise is going to increase by year 2030 by 0.5, which is actually the assumption for the predicted trajectory that most of the studies suggest, that 45% of the population will be exposed. But if we wait a couple more, like 30 more years, then the scenario of the sea level rise up until 2100, actually the sea level rise scenario is 1 meter. So it can start anywhere around 2060 up until 2100. Those are all predictions as well, because that's the tricky part with risk assessment or with natural disasters or with hazards, is that you can't predict it accurately. You can't pinpoint it. So when we get to 2060 up until 2100, 63.5% of the population will be exposed to sea level rise due to the fact that they're just settled in low-lying areas and the population is increasing around these areas, these risk areas, these flood-prone areas, etc. That's almost 2.5 times the amount that was there just 60 years ago, or maybe 100. Okay, so the breakdown of vulnerability. How can we say that it's vulnerable? Well, we say that it's vulnerable based on all of the things we just mentioned, but another thing is the contouring of the land itself. These are all aspects that tell us that these areas are going to be really exposed. But in the end, when we break down vulnerability, we're trying to give it kind of like a hierarchy, or like prioritizing the areas which are the most vulnerable. So the areas that are most vulnerable are as follows. So Hayrat Abu Qir, which is in Alexandria, Burulus Lagoon, which is in the Delta, Manzala, which is near Port Said, and further along Port Said. Those are all considered the high risk areas. From now on, like not from in 30 or 60 years, they're actually kind of under high risk from now. Which brings us to one of the scariest statistics, but we're gonna stay hopeful. The scary statistic is that Egypt ranks 4th in the flood risk parameters, 4th around the world. 41% of its population is actually exposed to flooding, which you can tell here that flood risk by population exposed is 40.5, which exposes almost roughly 40 million people. But that's not to say that Egypt isn't taking steps towards the right direction. We've recently had this Egypt National Climate Change Strategy, which was actually just developed in May 2022. And it is set forth for 2050. And the strategy promises the development of an interactive map, which will aid decision makers in identifying the areas which are most susceptible to risks in a more accurate way, especially those risks related to climate change, and therefore we can take the appropriate action. Another thing is, I'm sure all of you are aware that the COP27 was just held in Sharm el-Sheikh almost a month ago, and that is something which was a huge step in the sense of climate action all around the world in general, because this was the first time that the COP was actually held in a developing country. So yeah, during this year's conference as well, there was something called the Clean Construction Accelerator, which was announced. And this is an act that hopes to support the built environment sector in halving the emissions by 2030 for all new buildings and infrastructure projects, which is a great step for the architectural practice world in general, for architects all around the world, because most of the time, with climate change specifically, we sometimes fail to see where our role is. Me as an architect, what am I going to do with climate change? How can I help? How can I completely transform everything into zero energy, et cetera, et cetera? That's not the case. because it does require a lot of interdisciplinary interaction. But lately, architects have had a role to play, especially in climate change and reduction of emissions. Okay. So we're going to start moving on to the solution now. But before we move on to the solution, I wanted to ask all of you guys, do you think we should try to prevent climate change or try to adapt to climate change? Or both? Both. Okay. Anyone else?
I think we cannot prevent it.
Perfect. That's actually the correct answer. We can't prevent it.
We can adapt to it.
Exactly. Exactly. We can adapt to it. So the case is, when we talk about climate change, we just mentioned the word climate change. But climate has changed and it is changing. But ideally, you think, oh, we can stop it and that's halt it or like put an end to it. But there are solutions to that, and that's the way that we can adapt. All of these solutions, especially when it comes to architecture, they fall under the umbrella of resilient design, meaning that they can cope or adapt, mainly. So architecture is key to both mitigating and adapting to climate change. And the most recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it laid out kind of the bleak future, but it mentioned that adapting to climate change is going to become progressively harder if we fail to invest in protecting ourselves now. As we mentioned earlier on during this talk, that the rate at which climate change is occurring is way too fast for us to start saying we need to cut down emissions, we need to change the way that we live, go to work, commute, and pretty much do everything. That's going to take us time. We need that as well. But at the same time, we need to adapt or at least plan to adapt, which brings us to resilience or resilience. Resilience is the capacity of a system to revert back to its preliminary state. In another word, bounce back point or utility after experiencing any form of intervening distress. Resilience, if you actually Google the meaning of resilience, it means toughness, it means elasticity or bouncing back. The capability of one thing or a system or a building or anything to take a hard hit and still function. That's architecture-wise. That's like resilient architecture. So we have these dimensions of disaster resilience. So the dimensions apply to something related to the process of a disaster. Most of the time, this is when a disaster hits, when we're trying to respond to it. But before it, if we are managing, or if we're preparing, that's called preparedness actually. If we're preparing for it and we expect it, then when it happens, we respond to it. So the four main phases of any disaster is preparedness, which is the pre-disaster phase, response, which is during the disaster, recovery after the disaster, and then mitigation or prevention, which is kind of the time period between this disaster just ended, I just recovered from it, I need to plan, or I need to prevent or take all the necessary precautions for the next disaster when it comes. So lessons learned, basically. And mitigating is another way of saying reducing or kind of changing the directory of something. When I mitigate a disaster, I'm trying to reduce its impact, but not prevent. So there's a difference between that. So with preparedness, we have different types of preparedness techniques when it comes to disaster resilience. You can have detecting systems, you can have disaster monitoring. For instance, we have all these predictions. We expect these things. We expect coastal flooding by the year, for example, 2030 to be at a specific level. We expect it. That's preparedness. That is detection, monitoring, early warning signs. When we see any difference or shift in the way that the water surface is acting, for the past couple of years, that's when we start to realize, oh, something is happening, we need to be prepared. Response is, in this case, actually, this is response after a disaster has hit and you didn't really prepare that well for it. Then you're going to start to assess the damage and coordinate for post-disaster management. And afterwards, you have recovery. Recovery is another word for building back. Most of the time when we see any of those catastrophic disasters around the world, we see that it is extremely difficult for many countries, especially because coastal regions, they differ. I'm not going to generalize, actually. Some are developed countries and some are underdeveloped countries. So recovery is different for each geographical location around the world. So people could recover exponentially better than others because of just the resources that they have, or their economies doing better, and so on. So recovery is kind of related to the circumstances, in other words. And then mitigation and prevention, which is risk assessment that we just mentioned. We study the existing conditions and then we start to prepare for it in the end. And it's a cycle. So when it comes to resilience, you can be adaptive, you can be absorbative, or you can be transformative. The best type of resilience, of course, is all of them. To be honest, all three of them. You need to be adaptive in the sense that when, let's say, for instance, this is a house and then a flood hits it, you can be adaptive in the sense that you can try. We're going to see solutions and different types of practices, actually. This is adaptive. But absorbative is, for instance, you can redirect where the flood would head. So you're using your urban environment to absorb the shock or absorb the stress and revert it away from you. Transformative is to take this and use it for instance, for energy. You can take the force of the flood and use it for energy. So there are plenty different types of disaster resilience, but the ones that we're focusing on today are actually adaptive and absorptive. Okay, so can we measure resilience? Most of the time when it comes to the climate change type of research area, a lot of things are tricky for you to measure or to add numerical value to it. For us as engineers, we work with numbers, statistics, percentages, all of the above. But when it comes to something that is hard to predict, a lot of initiatives are actually trying to measure resilience. This is the BRI, which is the Building Resilience Index. It is actually an attempt to solve this challenge. The International Finance Corporation, which is the IFC, has developed this index, and it's an online tool and it's a self-assessment framework. So you can utilize this. If I have any architects here, you guys are well aware of the rating systems such as LEED or the BREEAM or any of the above, the Green Star even. That's a way of rating whether your building is sustainable or not. But the new narrative is to rate it or to assess it in the sense of whether it's resilient or not. So this online tool uses a standardized letter grade rating system to evaluate the building's capacity to stand up to shocks, and it continues to function in the sense of its structural integrity. There are so many factors. I do invite you all to actually check it out and to see it. It's up online. It's a very interesting and intriguing type of system, and this would really benefit the overall kind of trajectory towards resilient design. Okay, so we're kind of at the last but not least part of our talk, which is flood resilient architectural examples. Now, there are plenty of examples. Most of them are conceptual. Some of them are in the sense or in the form of strategies. Some of them are in the form of like a standoff kind of research project. But I tried to gather as much as much as I possibly can on an urban scale and a building scale so that we can go through all of these different examples that actually show us how we can respond. The first one is based on urban scale strategies. Now, there are 9 main urban scale strategies. When we look at this, we look at it in the sense of, I have an urban area. However, I'm still going to construct it. It's a new urban development. It's not something that is existing. And it's very important to note that because if something is existing and we're trying to adapt something onto it or implement it, that means we're retrofitting. So I'm going to be using that word a lot actually, but especially for the building scale. So I just needed to clear that out. So this is something which is absolutely new, a new development. So you have 9 ways in which you can actually protect this neighborhood or this city or this coastal area from a flood, expected flood. The first is cellular water bodies. And the way to do that is to actually kind of design the water itself or kind of have an area into your land which acts as a pool. And when the flood hits, it can just transcend in between it. You use these blue elements in order to integrate them with your landscape and your urban environment. The second one is to use soft defenses. You can literally use trees as buffers. Now that sounds very simple, but with time, throughout my research, I realized that the simple techniques are the ones that work best because they're natural techniques specifically. So most of the time, actually, when we have differences in currents and the bodies of water around us, we have coral reefs down there. We have like the ecosystem itself helps to regulate that for us. But because of our impact on them, there is a lot of turbulence and there is a lot of imbalance. So that leads us to reverting back to it. It's a full circle. We go back to using soft defenses and natural resources. The third one is adaptive defensive barriers. We can use our engineering techniques to make, these are actually called hard engineering defenses. There are soft and there are hard ones. And the adaptive defensive barriers could be these flood walls or these it's almost like a dam, but kind of redefined and in a smaller scale. Now, the fourth one is the phased realignment. This is a strategy that we could do on an urban scale in order to kind of, 1 second. I apologize for that. Okay, so phased realignment is, for instance, we have this urban city, it's on a slope. What we do is that we place these buildings in a way that is kind of a zigzag way. So in that sense, if water is to flood in this area, it will go in between these little groves and grooves that we've actually just done using design. The fifth is using lightweight structures, and we're going to actually elaborate further on why lightweight structures, contrary to what you would think. If something is heavy, it won't be as effective from like an impact. Actually, when it comes to flooding, coastal flooding, that is not the case. You want something light, so you want to use something called buoyancy, but we're going to get into that further on because there is an actual better example about this. And in the end is working in multiple levels, and not just multiple levels. You need to prioritize these kinds of multiple levels. For instance, the first line in front of the risk or the body of water that you have should be prioritized to areas or buildings that are not utilized all the time, temporary buildings, just in case anything is to occur. These frontliners take the impact, they kind of soften the blow as it goes further into the urban landscape, but even the damage to them does not cause any casualties or anything drastic, like the loss or the impact is minimized. So, we have raised services. One of the most important things that we need to highlight is services and infrastructure. in the case of any disaster around the world, the first thing that we do and we try to contain are critical infrastructure, roads, emergency access, all that stuff, electrical units, because once the power is out, a lot of things go out with it. So raising the services, especially the ones necessary for operation, for the buildings to stay operated, is extremely important. And the way that we can do that actually, it's to just make sure that they're above the flood level. So if this is the expected flood level and I'm compensating for that by providing a basement that could actually hold this water for a while, then I'm going to make sure that these services are placed on top of it. So diffusive patterning is another way of just like different realignment of the buildings, and that's just a way of making sure that the stream of the flood is diffused, and as it goes across these buildings, it starts to lose its momentum. Finally, designing on contours, using the natural contour of the land, because the contour is there for a specific natural reason. It's just the way that the land was created, and we can utilize this natural occurring contour in order to build all these different levels with these different priorities and different building usages. Another concept is something called inside out, which you can take the private property and elevate it, or you can take the street and elevate it, whichever, or both. You can do both. However, this is very difficult to retrofit. So in that case, a scenario like this, you would have already planned. You are expecting that by in a couple of years, there could be floodwaters, and in that case, you're designing in order to completely mitigate the impact of these floodwaters. So it's not something that you can already retrofit. This is one of the conceptual examples that I wanted to mention because it's actually based in Abu Qir, which is in Alexandria. It's one of the most flood-prone areas. And the way that they did it is that they studied the topography of the land and the sea, and they suggested buoyancy, which is these very large floating structures that they can place these important docks actually in order to ensure that the economic practices carry on, because this is at a port. Okay. Last but not least, the building scale retrofitting. The first being the flood prone house, which was done by Studio Peak. I don't really know how to say this, but I think it's Ancona, and it's based in San Francisco. This was a cost-effective and comfortable and adaptable solution to flooding. So what they did is they have these prefabricated metal moment frames, and prefabricated means that they have already been done in a construction. They have already been produced and manufactured, and all you need to do is just transport them, onto the site. And they're supported by these hybrid concrete and steel columns, and the foundation system is made in a way where it uses 30% less material and space on the ground floor. So if you can recognize a pattern here, elevation is always a way to adapt, become more resilient to flooding. So it is expected to resist the rising sea levels of up to 12 feet, which is 3.66 meters. Now, the structure system itself allows for easy construction because it's prefabricated, and transportation, of course, because it's already pre-made. The installation process is simple because, especially with prefabricated units, it's more like a Lego. So you just place them together and they're done. You just constructed a building. And they apply local materials, so it's site-specific. It adds like this site-specific quality to the architecture. Now, the truss assembly contains a cantilever. A cantilever is, for instance, an extended, like, how can I describe? Your balcony is a cantilever because it doesn't have columns, it's just horizontal. And there's a specific distance to that where the structure can support itself, actually. So it's just freehanging. It contains these stairs. They have external stairs onto a cantilever, which is like a balcony. which provides a point from which the unit can be easily expanded and combined. So it works like the structure system works as a Lego, and the entire form or building works as Tetris. You can put a couple of them next to each other. So the prefabricated metal unit that is in it within the structure system. It is set on a pair of concrete and steel columns, as we mentioned, but it's secured by a rebar reinforced foundation. And in the situation of a flooding, all of your water would be coming in this direction. So the staircase or the main axis is not trying to go against it, and the water can just flow through it. So not only that, but the water, when it flows through it, it flows through this area, which is considered to be like the basement area. This is where I'm going to let the water get in and out of this area. I'm just going to wait it out until these places start to dry out. And then in the end, I can use these floating surfaces in order to regain access to the rest of the area. This is another way of suggesting the same kind of thing, but this is called the amphibious house. The reason for that is it is actually placed on kind of like a dynamic platform, which rises with the sea level rise in a form, it acts like a boat, basically. So the second that the water enters into the basement level, it starts to actually provide stress upwards, so the structure will move and float. That's why it's called an amphibious house, because it can live on and off water. So this is your resting position. As soon as the flood water starts to enter the basement level, it starts to float upwards. So this is actually built on a small island in River Thames in London. It's a 3-story house, so it was made by the architects, Baca Architects, and just like we mentioned, it floats the second that any water enters into its basement, and it's heavy enough to lift the structure up. It's made by lightweight timber, and this is one of the reasons why I told you that lightweight structures are the best thing we can have in flood-prone areas. Now, this is retrofitting guidelines. This is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It's in the US, and they have this entire guideline on retrofitting existing buildings due to the different zones. And not only do they have the retrofitting guidelines here, they also have the New York City Planning Department. They have an entire set of examples on how we can use these types of retrofitting guidelines, as New York is actually extremely prone to flooding, and it's densely populated as well. So one of the best things that we can be doing is elevation, raising your house so that the lower floor is above the flood level. And you can do this in many ways. You can provide a gateway in between it so that you can allow the water to get through it. You can raise it on pillars. You can use different types of materials or different types of water intrusion strategies, water extrusion and intrusion strategy. So for instance, this is an example. You have a subgrade basement, as we mentioned before. You make sure that the level of the ground floor and all of the facilities, that the necessary MEPs, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, and the services that keep your building operational are above even that level. So there are different types, but they're actually according to ranking. It's a hierarchy. So we have wet floodproofing, relocating, dry floodproofing, flood walls, and demolition. Of course, we never want to reach a point where we need to demolish an area and kind of take it somewhere else. Thank you so much for your comment. Dr. Safa, thank you so much.
Most welcome. You're most welcome. It's very, very informative. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for attending. This is the pleasure is all mine, really.
Okay,
I'm gonna wrap this up. I promise. I'm not gonna keep talking about this for long. But this is another example of retrofitting, but in the context of preserving our preserving something which is very impactful. For instance, this is a very well-known building by Ms. the row. It's iconic when it comes to modernist architecture. I can tell that, okay. Sammy, what about the existing building, which is not designed using any strategy? Okay, I'm gonna get to that right away. But the way that you can actually do that is through risk assessment and to analyze the kind of things that you have in the building itself, whether it's a material or like the structure system. You need to assess all of the existing integrities of the structural system, of the materials, and so on and so on. And then we work with it through material science, such as absorptive material or waterproofing or damp proofing or a form of water intrusion and water extrusion strategies where you find a way to have a gateway for the water to be extruded. That's all you need. And to protect the rest of your services or necessary operational services. Thank you so much for the answer that you did. So this is actually another way of doing it. It's just kind of like the amphibious house. It's just a platform which is diamond. It's below grade installation, and you can actually excavate the land underneath it, and then you can place this installation and it would raise and float the house in case of extreme flooding. This is the New York Department planning, and they take it according to strategies such as coastal defenses, buildings, infrastructures, residences, and businesses. So they tackle resiliency in the form of multiple levels of the society itself. And this is actually a good example to answer your question. When you mentioned how can we already do it for existing areas? If you have a basement level or if you have a ground level, this level could be transformed into dry or wet proofing according to what you might need. So for instance, you can add bracing to this level. You can completely cut off the ground level, revert all the systems, make sure that you have almost like the ground level is going to be an area where the flood can come through and come out of, and the level above that would be kind of like with skyscrapers, we have a mechanical floor where all the services are there. So this is another way of actually adapting to something which is existing and it doesn't take into context the fact that it has floods coming in the future. So to summarize it, when we talk about urban techniques, we can talk about hard or soft defenses. This could work on an urban scale, and of course it works with buildings, but in the sense of soft defenses, such as landscape, different types of trees and plants that are actually in need of a lot of water, for instance, so they can act as very protective buffers. We can use zoning for the urban scale so that we place areas in different hierarchies according to the threat and to their importance to maintaining everyday life. We can try to utilize the water intrusion and extrusion strategies that we talked about, a way where we redirect the flow of water. We can elevate the structure, and we've seen that a lot, and we can use buoyancy, which is the ability to float. These are my references, and thank you so much for your time. Any questions?
I'd like to thank you. Actually, I'd like to thank you very much. I have learned a lot. I enjoyed every minute in this presentation. You are a perfect presenter, by the way.
Thank you so much. The pleasure is all mine.
Really, and you make it very easy. You presented the problems, then you told us how to solve such problems. This presentation is highly appreciated, and your time is highly appreciated. Thank you so much, and keep going because you are perfect. And I hope you the best future you can have.
Thank you so
for
much.
your time.
Thank you for your kind words. This
Welcome.
is honestly more than I could have ever wished for. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you, Justina. I'm not really sure when I'm going to be presenting more talks, but I'll let you know for sure. Thank you so much, Shiali. Thank you. Thank you, Mai. And thank you, Mahmoud. Thank you. Thank you, Rowan. No one has any questions? Are you guys sure?
You answered them all because you are a perfect presenter.
Thank you. That's so sweet. Thank you so much. All right. I think our talk is concluded. And I can't wait to thank you so much for the amazing feedback, by the way. And thank you for your time and for attending on a Friday. So thank you. And I hope to see you all soon. Have a great weekend and enjoy.
Thank you so much,
Emin.
Mirette.
Thank
This was
you.
great.
Thank you so much. Thank you. By the way, I love your illustrations and your the way of the presentation itself. My God, mashallah.
Thank you so
It's
much.
amazing.
Thank
It's
you.
amazing. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's actually a software that you can use. It's online and it's for free. It really helps me with all my presentations. I love it.
But it's not with the app only. The app without Dr. Mirette will never work, right?
Thank you so much.
Because the app
But
is
you
there.
can use it. It's amazing. It really does help, and it's so simple to use for your presentations. But
thank
I'm
you so
so
much.
glad that you liked it. Thank you so much for your kind
Thank
words.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Wish you all the best, inshallah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mirette. This was so helpful and this is great. Thank you so much. And of course, we'll have more talks with you. Thank you everyone for attending. As I mentioned, the session was recorded and it will be uploaded to our social media. So you can check out the talk again if you would like to. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.